Greetings. I'm your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for taking the time to check us out. If you're a returning listener, subscriber, or one of our very valued patrons, thank you so much for tuning back in. I want to thank all of the good people that took time out of their day and evenings to be part of and check out our week of shows here at TIR. We kicked off the week with our conversation with Professor excuse me, and author Allison T. Butler, where we discussed her latest book, Judgment of Gender, How Women Are Centered and Silenced in Pop Culture. We follow that episode up with a viewing of the 1959 BAFTA award-winning, casually racist film, Sapphire.
We coming for you, nigga!
Oh, yeah. All day in that movie. And I loved every minute of it. Wednesday, we had a bit of a doubleheader where Deep State Cuba kicked the day off by giving us a domestic fresh hell run down the opposed to the usual foreign policy analysis. We followed that up with our FIFA show on Beyond the Beyond the Red Zone. Thursday, we discussed if we're captivated by the public image, and we had a special Friday show just yesterday with famed musician Conan Neutron to explain everything you think you know about music is wrong. We have playlists on the TIR YouTube page where you can find all these past programs and more in chronological order. At TIR, we pride ourselves by not churning out disposable content. We try to create programming that is thoughtful, challenging, political, cultural, historical, irreverent, and at times downright chaotic in what we hope is in the best way possible. We cover the stories and ideas that matter, not always the ones that trend. We bring you conversations rooted in analysis, solidarity, and intellectual curiosity. And we do this without selling out to the algorithm and without trying to become another outrage factory. But none of this happens without you, the patrons, the supporters, the people who tune in, argue, question, and help keep this show alive. It is your contributions, large and small, that make this show possible. So if you enjoy what we do here on TIR, then consider becoming a patron or a paid YouTube subscriber. For as little as $3 a month or a one-time payment of $30 for the year, you can have access to movie nights, champagne rooms, the Crisis Papers, our new weekly newsletter, and you get the satisfaction of knowing that your small donation is a major part of keeping TIR on the air. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get to why you guys came here for in the first place. To say happy birthday to America.
We coming for you, nigga!
Maybe. A little bit. Stop. With a slew of DSA victories of late, left populism is beginning to look like the new political zeitgeist, challenging decades of neoliberal decay and stagnation, perhaps even replacing MAGA as the dominant object of political fascination and anxiety. Many Americans are searching for answers to everything from the rising cost of living to endless wars and regime change missions abroad. For some, MAGA appeared to offer an answer to elite establishment neoliberal politics. But perhaps Donald Trump, a man literally born into wealth and with a long history of unscrupulous real estate dealings, was never quite the anti-hero people imagined him to be. Sure, you may get to stick it to the libs, but nearly 2.5 terms of Trump have coincided with soaring inflation, and that's before we even get into what his administration has done domestically to undermine whatever shards of democracy remain. But is it fair to blame Trump alone for ICE raids or Supreme Court decisions that are permanently reshaping immigration policy? He's operating within institutions that were left intact. He isn't building something entirely new. He's bulldozing through the shattered remains of systems that we allowed to be hollowed out. Our guests today have written a book asking what comes after the allure of after the allure of populism fades. How do we organize? Who do we organize? How do we begin to navigate the contradictions of a working class that is so often valorized in bipartisan populist discourse? From our guest's latest book, The People Are Not One. In our own moment, we confront a similar discussion between inherited traditions and the demands of the present. Among its many symptoms, the most egregious is the growing tendency to conceive class struggle almost exclusively through a populist framework. The populist drift in contemporary socialist politics refers to a tendency to conceive of class conflict in terms that ultimately serve liberal interests, reducing the working class to an abstract and Manchean symbol rather than a historically concrete social force. This populist drift is inherently class collaborationist and often sees the actors of history as outside of the working class or the labor movement, as it relies on a mythical conception of the working class and fails to account for class antagonisms and fragmentation. In this way, as Arthur Borriello and Anton Jaeger have argued, populist politics is best defined as a politics that aims to transcend class divisions, but not social stratification. The argument develops in two directions. First, a theoretical account of how post-Marxists and more recently democratic socialists came to adopt populist methods of class analysis and the limitations this has imposed on socialist practice. Secondly, it calls for the construction of strong theoretical alternatives rooted in Marxist solutions alongside rigorous empirical analysis of working class fragmentation. Our central claim is that populism on both the right and left obscures real class antagonism by projecting a false unity of the people, reducing the working class to an abstract moral category and thereby undermining the practical work of building genuine class consciousness and solidarity. We contend that a viable socialist strategy after left populism must confront three core obstacles: the enduring dominance of liberal ideology, the fragmentation of working class solidarity under bourgeois and racial divisions, and the complexities of building an internationalist, anti-imperialist politics. Again, that was from our guest book. Before we bring our guests in, we have a TIR Saturday panel. Please welcome my homie, my dog, my co-host, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Prince of Miami. Please welcome the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat, peace and greetings to the audience, peace and greetings to Jason Miles. I was having some technical difficulties. Please forgive me.
Oh, you're fine. She is the voice of reason. She is M. Tucson.
Hello. Happy post Canada Day.
That's what's up.
Happy 4th of July.
What is this?
I'm repping This Is Revolution today and some pretty Smurfy glasses. Better than yours.
I know where you got that picture.
Yeah. I cut somebody out of it.
You cut Ben Burgess out of it. You should have made Ben Burgess a Muppet as well.
I thought about it.
That's me and Ben Burgess at his parents' house the night before we left to New York for the New York Live show.
Oh, really?
You guys turn yourself into Muppets?
She has access to the TIR Canva, and everyone can be a Muppet. So watch your back, Pascal.
I thought about Pascal.
Right now, Pascal Robert, put your profiles on private because all the photos can turn you into a Muppet.
Well, happy 250 years of very serious foolishness.
You know what's funny? Before we bring our guests in, and I think they would agree with this, Pascal and I and Derick all went to Daniel's house in DC, and we spoke at a thing for, I almost said A. Philip Randolph. It's another black man with abbreviation names.
C.L.R. James.
Yes.
Wow. You diaspora Negroes sure do know your other diaspora Negroes, don't you?
He's from diaspora.
Daniel Tutt was a phenomenal host, by the way.
Daniel Tutt was a phenomenal host, but we actually had some very serious discussions in Daniel Tutt's house that weekend, and I was able to record like 30 seconds of one of them, but it was a lot of fun. So please welcome our very good friends in real life and on screens, C. Derick Varn, host of Varn Vlog, and the Daniel Tutt.
I just want to make it known now to the public that Daniel Tutt is a host superb. The man opened up his domicile, took us in, got us Popeye's fried chicken. Not to fulfill any kind of racial stereotypes, we requested Popeyes.
I think the Tutt family knows their way around Popeyes.
It was a splendid weekend.
Yeah, that was great to have you, Pascal. We got to do it again. Varn and I will be at Busboys, the same venue we did the CLR James event, for a book tour. So in actually 2 weeks.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about why we're here today, and that's to say happy birthday to America by saying, what are we going to do about left populism? You both argue that populism obscures real class antagonisms by replacing class with the people, using finger quotations as I say that. At what point does broad coalition building become populism, and where do you draw that line strategically?
Sure, that's off, Daniel.
Yeah. Well, happy 4th, friends and comrades. Happy Settler Colonial Murder Day, as Pascal was saying in the chat. Well, I don't know, Jason. I mean, there's not quite a scientific answer to this question. Part of the problem is the history of populism and the theory behind it. A lot of what we analyze is populism as a type of spontaneous tendency of theory, kind of like a failure of socialist theory. So the book is really coming at it from that standpoint, first and foremost. But of course, in the subtitle, we have the concept of strategy. So strategy is a big part of the text. I don't know if there's a clear answer to this other than to say that since the Popular Front emerges onto the scene in the general, we could say, historical sweep of the post-war context, we perform a kind of analysis, right, that pretty much the majority of Marxist, or what we sometimes pejoratively call post-Marxist currents of theory, even like Herbert Marcuse and his idea that the industrial proletariat has left the scene, we need to replace them with students, to the 1985 intervention of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. There seems to be somewhat of a consensus, that populism is the only means by which we can reactivate a socialist politics. And for us, this is something like a betrayal, not in any kind of like reductive, class reductive, or sort of orthodox Marxist way, but it's like a practical, strategic blind spot. And part of the rationale there, of course, is the idea of what actually do we mean by class collaborationist politics or class independent politics. And I've always really admired Derick Varn, for insisting on and clarifying, the historical roots of class independent politics. It's not easy to even think that form of politics. I mean, you mentioned in your opening, Jason, the challenges of liberal ideology. And we should never underestimate that. We should never underestimate that. So I think, how do we see populism? How do we distinguish it? Why is populism, according to our title, over? Might be an interesting question as well. After left populism, which the use of the word after left populism is also both a historical declaration that indeed the populism we saw from the Occupy period up through Sanders and Corbyn has died. So there's a sequence of a death in political possibility, of militant radical left-wing possibility, and what we're dealing with now is a new conjuncture. Let us analyze what happened in the past to improve our analysis, both theoretically and practically, moving forward. But I guess maybe I'll kick it to Derick here and I'll stop. Maybe we could say that this tendency towards class collaborationism and this kind of notion that socialist politics can be copacetic, right, to cooperation with liberal progressive bourgeois parties. We're trying to challenge that idea. And I think that when socialism is kind of lathered onto the left progressive parties, populism almost becomes inevitable. Derick, what would you want to add to that, comrade?
Yeah. To echo a lot of what Daniel was saying, I would say one of the things that we have to deal with class independence politics, in addition to defining it, and we don't think that, I want to be clear on this, we don't think the socialist movement will only just have perfectly clean, hard hat, blue collar proletarians in it. We don't think that's mathematically possible. We don't think that's historically ever been the case, actually. And the reason why we bring that up is that does not mean that we should give up any notion of developing the working class or class independent action. The issue with populism from our standpoint is that it is a precursor notion to socialism that emerges all the way back in the beginnings of bourgeois politics. So back in the French Revolution, it is a form of bourgeois politics. It is the bourgeois politics, particularly when paired with national liberation and the 1950s and 60s, et cetera, which we would not argue was not good. We shouldn't support. That's not the point. That has dominated because it looks like it has an easy means to popularity. We don't do this so much in the book because we only concern ourselves with populism after the middle 20th century. But in some of our writings together beyond this, we've gone back and explored the shifting class alliances that have been in populist alliances, the focus on the peasantry, the focus on the sharecroppers and the American case, the tendency to alternate between having intellectuals go and do back to the people movements, and then when that fails, to do outright terrorism. The way that liquidates out in the 20th century into basically liquidating yourself over and over into bourgeois politics because you do not think there is a viable working class subject for whatever reason. We go through a bunch of different theories, and Muffin Laclau's the most pervasive one, but Andre Gortz, who's a post-Marxist in the 1980s, who talked about the disillusion of the working class due to automation, the focus on the quote-unquote lumpen, this idea that we could do these kinds of earlier politics again. So, for example, a lot of times left populism is even looking for classes to do coalitions with. It's not even just that it's clear who they're going to side with. Sometimes it's petit bourgeois, sometimes it's the peasantry, sometimes it's various intermediary stratas that often get picked up by more right-wing movements, such as the what we call the lumpenized elements of all the classes, and we use the verb form for reason. We can go into that later. Or the petit bourgeois, or people like the professional managerial types who are socialized to be petit bourgeois even when they're actually not. So we talk a little bit about this strata of people and how they have really divergent class interest from their socialization. And by that we mean that all the institutions, not just university, when we talk about PMC stuff, we tend to focus on university culture and maybe HR culture, but it's much larger than that. The professional institutions, the unions around these professional institutions, the trade guilds, the universities themselves all assume a 20th century professionalization that these people are going into fields as basically petit bourgeois individuals, meaning that they sell their means of production directly and do not draw a salary. That's not true for the majority of the PMC anymore, if it ever was, but it definitely isn't true past 1990. Even the Ehrenreichs realize this. They talk about it. But those institutions have not changed that socialization. They are still operating on that socialization. Daniel and I can definitely speak to it because we went through it. Like, we went through it ourselves. The reason why we think this focuses on the moral category, though, of workers, like the 99% versus the 1%, that also mistakes the claims of socialism in some key way, is the reason why people focus on workers is usually because they're poor, because they deserve it, because of the suffering, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to sound very callous, but as a person who comes out of my background as blue-collar working class, those stories don't move me. I know the suffering of my class. And you know what? We can do the whole, like, I don't need to read Marx and Lenin. I have Marx all over my body that teaches me that whole bullshit, but it's bullshit. It's always been bullshit. There is nothing about suffering that inherently teaches you anything other than how to suffer. And I know that's a strong statement, but we pointed out that the Marxist contention about the proletariat had very little to do with their suffering. It's not a moral claim. So ameliorating the suffering of the proletariat by populist policies may be good. We're not necessarily opposing that, but it's not socialism, because socialism is about two things. One is the empowerment of the working class, and two is the abolition of class as a whole. And the Marxist argument has always been that the latter is only possible through the valorization and subjectivity of the proletariat, because they don't have incentives to collect property as a class. As individuals we do, but as a class we don't. And they also can reproduce society on their own in their collective knowledge base, not any individual. Again, that's the Marxist gambit. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is a lot of things dip into populism when they start focusing on the proletariat suffering and to be acted to ameliorate that suffering, in particular by some other force, usually the government. But it could be any number of forces, which, again, we're not some kind of weird accelerationist to argue that, like, we necessarily should oppose anything that's got any policy that would help the proletariat, such as socialized medicine or childcare, any of that. These can be bridges and immediate demands, but if they don't empower the working class as a class for its own interest, not just our policies for them, it relies on class collaborationism. And to do that, you have to build a synthetic subject that erases the contradictions of interest between the classes. So at best, you have a temporary social peace, and everything flows from there. The argument we basically say is that temporary social peace is contradictory and impossible. And because it is impossible, a lot of populist politics degrade into either authoritarian demagoguery, because you have to just force people to get along who have conflicted interests, or cultural bullshit. Because what else can you talk about? Like, because the cultural stuff erases the interests that are more material in society. Not that cultural stuff doesn't matter, it does. But and it ties into materiality to some degree. But if, you think about this in terms of like the George Floyd uprisings, and what do you get? You get DEI initiatives at elite universities, and you get all kind,
But would you say what you're talking about right now when it comes to like DEI initiatives at elite universities? Would you say that's a co-optation of a certain kind of left populism by liberal elites?
Well, I mean, the question is, you're going to have to ask yourself: is do you think that co-optation is inevitable, given what the left populists set out to do?
But yeah, well, I think we should be careful though, Jay, because we can't say every expression of popular rebellion can be kind of coded as left populist.
Agreed.
This is part of the thing we try to, like, there's this young communist magazine which has been our first critics, because we've had a couple reviews of the book. They're called Geese Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
They're worth reading. It's very interesting, and they sort of put forward that notion, right, which is, yeah, like spontaneous uprisings can be kind of immediately defined as left populist. And I think that actually betrays the fact that populism has actually a coherent view of political economy. It actually diverts from a Marxist point of analysis, and we should hold populists to the fire definitionally as it pertains to what they stand for. And moreover, if you take a movement like BLM, I'm not sure that the BLM movement would even see itself through a populist lens, So there's a lot of ambiguities there, and I think but to some extent, the left populist tendency can be defined as a sort of floating signifier of what's permissible. You could almost think about left populism as that form of liberal progressive politics that presents this sort of veneer of a radicalism, which is ultimately a radicalism that is contained within the institutional boundaries of liberal progressivism, right?
Mm-hmm. Pascal, I feel like you have something you want to add to this conversation.
I have a plethora of thoughts here. How much of this discourse revolves around a basic reaction to the reality of the realpolitik on the ground? I understand the more sophisticated intellectual musings of those who are wedded to classical Marxist analysis of the political moment. But the realpolitik is that we haven't had a left in this country since the new left of the 60s. And that, frankly, there's about enough people to fit a football field to have the conversation we're having right now about whether or not, those who are leaning towards social democracy are veering towards left populism, or are they really living up to the Marxist ideas of what true socialism is? I would make the argument that this is kind of, it's an academic argument. It's an academic argument because as much as we're talking about the working class, it's completely divorced from the reality of the working class in America, man. As much as we can say, we can make the argument that, the proletariat, just simply fulfilling the needs of the proletariat with programs like socialized medicine and universal free education and child care is good. We're not opposed to that, but that's not socialism. Man, that goes a long ass way in today's society when we're having literal robber barons own most of the rental properties and societies in this country. Are we so wedded to the ideological purity of what is the Marxist definition of socialism that we don't realize that how divorced the reality on the ground is from people even caring about this shit is?
Toussaint, do you want to add anything?
I don't know. I thought Pascal was a trained Marxist. He's sounding a bit like a populist. I don't know.
Pascal is doing the Van Damme thing where he's doing the splits between two trees.
I guess so. I mean, maybe you guys should explain your view of populism, why it would be important to have a Marxist definition for these things and what the input is.
I'm just going to say it with that, if you believe this entirely, if you just say this is an academic discourse, which I don't think it is, I don't know why the fuck you're a socialist. I mean, and I'm going to be that
socialist. Maybe I'm just a populist.
Oh,
maybe you are. And fine. At that point, though,
maybe I'm a revolutionary.
we don't get into who's a real revolutionary or who's a real Marxist in the book because frankly I don't give a shit.
Yeah. Don't talk about that.
Like the issue that we have with left populism, and remember, we aren't arguing that there's one good form of Marxism which everyone's going to go into. The issue that we have with left populism is that as an answer to the practicality of things as they are, I'm just going to tell you, it's been the dominant mode since the middle of the 20th century, and it was the dominant mode of the left for most of its history until Marxism came about. It has not succeeded in lieu of Marxism.
Let me be totally frank here. I actually agree because I can put on the hat of being somewhat of an intellectual. I don't like to call myself an intellectual, so that's what people to judge. I sympathize with your argument. Let's get down to brass tacks. Do I think it's bullshit that we have a socialism that's rooted in Democratic Party entryism? Yes, I think it's bullshit. I don't think that's socialism. I think that's basically trying to make people who call themselves socialists Democrats, and it ends up having us be surrendering to the bourgeois party of the left. And that is a problem. I agree with your argument that what we are having in America today is not real socialism. I agree with you that Zohar Mamdani is not a real socialist. I agree with you that the Michael Harrington formulation of what he thinks DSA should be is kind of bullshit. Then my instincts tell me that I am more sympathetic to the more actual Marxist, I would even say Marxist-Leninist, more radical prescription of what socialism should be. But I'm also someone who is a realist in understanding that that's me and 5 other motherfuckers that believe that. The reality is social democracy wouldn't be a bad thing after 50 years of neoliberalism, and people are going to get excited about that. I'm not divorced from realizing that. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm antagonistic to what you guys are saying. I get what you guys are saying. You guys are reacting to the rise of Bernie Sanders' quote-unquote socialism, and you're saying, as actual Marxists, this shit is bullshit. Let's call it spade a spade. That's what you guys are doing. I get that. But I also realize that, listen, this is the furthest we've gotten since the 60s of having people even be able to say they want to be a socialist. And I'm not ready to say that's a bad thing. That's all I'm saying here.
Would you so a lot of, look, this book was written, I believe, before a lot of the victories we saw recently in New York. And I think you had finished this before Mamdani won, right, Derick?
We started writing it way before Mamdani won, and then not way before. I think I was about 2 months before. And we finished it about a month after the first round of drafting, about a month after Mamdani won, and then we revised it for an additional couple of months. The turnaround in this book was relatively fast. The thing I will say is that we don't talk about Mamdani hardly at all in the book. We have in responses because we're told to count this as major wins. My response to that has been, and I think Daniel would agree with this, is that a lot of these wins are being counted prematurely and somewhat dishonestly. Like when we go into Mamdani's policies, with the exception of the pied-à-terre tax, almost every major policy that he's built out of is actually from Bill de Blasio. It's been expanded by him and rebranded as a DSA move, but they're all based on the legal framework enabled by Bill de Blasio explicitly. And they mostly pull on the same program levers. And he's been more and more incorporated into standard Democratic Party politics, including with a lot of Clinton and Obama people in his cabinet and advisors. My point about Mamdani has been it's too early to say how this is ultimately gonna play out, but we can already see elements of the DSA, particularly New York DSA, which is the largest DSA branch by an order of magnitude. It's 15K.
Located, right? It's where the
1/5 of the organization is in 3 of the 5 New York boroughs. And I'm serious about that. And I'm also specific that it's only 3 of the 5 boroughs because they don't actually have that much interpenetration into places like the Bronx, which are more class coded as blue collar working class. My point about this with Mamdani is just, I don't think anything Mamdani is doing bad. I'm not willing to call it a failure, or even that it won't eventually lead to socialism or a real socialist movement in America. My issue is claiming that as a win when he's been in office for a few months and then changing your own position. So the NYDSA, for example, and the DSA National congratulated Mamdani's slate for winning, and of course they would. But they said it was the socialist who won, ignoring that Brad Lanner was one of the people that they actually, Mamdani intervened to get an actually DSA endorsed candidate out of the race so that Lander would stay as part of his coalition. And 2, is not a DSA candidate at all. And so when the DSA itself switched what it was saying, they were at the Groundwork Caucus, which is the caucus most associated with the NYC DSA, have been declaiming that they were angry with Mamdani for not endorsing the entire slate of the New York DSA. And then as soon as Mamdani's slate won, they said it was a DSA slate, which is not the case. So what you are seeing now is they're also changing their criterions on winning. When it makes sense, practically, you get people excited, right? Now, my thing about this is arguably, and this might make people a little bit uncomfortable. When we say the U.S. doesn't have a left right now, that I suspect in some deep way that's true. But I would also say that the interpenetration of society of leftist ideas is probably the greatest it's been since the New Left. Actually, probably more than that. And left populism does play a role in that. The question that I have is, if you look at Europe when this has been tried, and then I'm gonna let Daniel talk, but you look at Podemos and Syriza, when left populists fail, the costs are astronomical. You see liquidations, like you see buildups that are super rapid. So you see these groups like Syriza or Podemos grow very fast. And then when they collapse, they utterly collapse and their agenda is erased.
Often leads to quasi-fascism.
Right. And so a lot of my push on this is like, how do we deal with someone like Mamdani? Because I don't think it's for me and Daniel to call actually whether or not Mamdani is going to be ultimately good or bad for socialism. I don't think we can know that. And I'm not hubristic enough to make that kind of prediction for the future. And I've actually argued that a couple of times. What I can say for sure, though, is that if these peons to progressives backfire, the socialists will be blamed. They are already being discursively set up to be blamed, even if the reasons why have nothing to do with any ideas of socialism. And this is where where a lot of stuff hits the road for us. And I'm gonna let Daniel talk.
No, I want to add. Sorry to cut you off, Daniel. Yeah. I mean, I do want to add that there is a real conversation to be had here, which is after populism fades, which it does fade, right? It faded in 2018, and we saw a lot of the quote unquote socialist wins in blue cities, if you will. Like Derick said, be destroyed, which is why I think this conversation is important to have. I literally have an organizer from Los Angeles in my house right now, and we were having a very spirited conversation. Pascal, he's also one of you people, the Haitian.
Okay.
He's not a white. He's Haitian Jamaican. But one of the conversations I was having was kind of more of a theoretical one. Well, he was, kind of rooted in, well, I don't really care about that. I care about this. It's like, but what happens after that fades? Because yes, people hate, the police, or they want this thing and they want that thing. But what happens when you can't give it to people right away and it takes time?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do after the rhetoric that got someone elected fades? Not everybody's going to be super excited about potholes getting fixed.
I'd like to ask our guests a very direct question, Daniel and Varn. Do you guys agree with the argument that Democratic Party entryism as a strategy for a socialist movement is problematic?
Yes.
That was an easy answer.
Not even a little bit problematic. Go ahead, Daniel.
Pascal, I sense a touch of nihilism in your question, but that's fair and valid, because you're also using a kind of quasi-populist logic of, well, we're not the majority, we're some ascetic,
and I
irrelevant. But go ahead.
No, and your critique is fair. It's a just critique of what I'm saying.
As you know, the strategy that we talk about is related to this concept of the merger thesis, about the integration of the intellectuals with the workers. And we don't ever say that the institutional barriers we face are so immense that precludes us from doing the merger thesis. In other words, in your question, Pascal, was a kind of implication, right, which I think is a false one, that suggests because America and its political system has legally prohibited an independent Marxist party to emerge in any viable way, to think how to influence in a Marxist way existing politics is an exercise in narcissism. I reject that. Because it's not an either-or logic. These ideas are going to be absorbed by people as readers. This is a pamphlet. It's a pamphlet that we wrote. And it's trying also to touch people, to say something to people that we feel is not being said, right? The force of our argument does not necessarily depend upon us having a stadium full of adoring fans and a big audience and so on. I mean, I don't think that history or the history of radical movements really shows that that's how things work in terms of the causality of how a pamphlet can inspire things you never know. You never know what will seep into people and shape their thinking. And then, the merger thesis is also not reliant. It's a civil society strategy. It's a civil society strategy where it's almost like the chicken and the egg problem come back, whereby it's not so much we start with the Marxist party, we start with the right institutional edifice. How that's paid for is a question mark. It's rather the opposite. It's that we start with a new thinking amongst the workers and amongst the intellectuals to rethink and rejuvenate that unity. Of course, what's a worker? What's an intellectual? The book tries to also redefine those, or reclarify what a worker and an intellectual is, away from some of this left populist nihilism, which is highly based on elite theory, which we see as problem, not because we wish to have the perfect Marxist theory of the working class, but simply because it homogenizes real social antagonisms into incoherent blocks of antagonistic. So the left populist way of thinking about the root of how this society exploits and immiserates people actually does not think along class lines. You're not really thinking along class lines when you're thinking in a left populist way, I would contend. Because class is sort of like a relation to the site where surplus value is extracted, right? And I think Derick made a nice point that we are more interested in exploitation, not so much with suffering. So you get a lot of this stuff, and you even get it, bless her heart, in like, the Catherine Liu PMC stuff, where it becomes a cudgel of this like homogenous hammer where everyone somehow has some magic superstructure force that makes them think and act in the same way because they are somehow coded as PMC, right? But that's not actually how the Marxist vision of class antagonism thinks or encourages us to think about conflict, about antagonism, and yes, about suffering, but not suffering as understood through some kind of Christian worldview, because I would say immiseration actually produces, proletarianization produces a very paradoxical form of suffering, if you've ever seen it, which is why the working class are the only agents really that can speak to the unique form of exploitation that they experience. And they're not permitted to speak to that exploitation in the dominant civil society institutions that we live in. That's part of the problem. And that's part of the reason why we wrote the book, And so can a Democrat NGO, hyper-finance nonprofit allow for the merger thesis? No, it cannot. But a bunch of people that see that it cannot will produce an institution that will allow it to happen. So it's like that. I would say it's an order of, let's not be nihilist because we lack the institutions and the power. We're almost like, it's an order of causality.
I just want to let you know that I comradely accept your critique, and I everything I'm being shared with you is being shared out of comradely and brotherly love and affection. I think that what you guys put together is a very, very good analysis of your thesis. I actually don't think it's nihilistic, and I think it's actually quite optimistic. But maybe, and I will concede to you, Daniel, that I am not. I'm very nihilistic about the capacity of the left. I'm very honest with you. I see what we have to surmount against to try to get the most basic left victories, and it's questionable to me whether it's possible. So I'm willing to acknowledge that and even be corrected.
And let me say, moreover, we're not trying to make a claim that we're interested in throwing a wedge that would somehow derail Mamdani, that Mamdani and wherever it goes is somehow always going to be antithetical to our goals and aims and interests. That's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily true. I think at the same time, if we don't have an appendage of the radical left that stays true to a materialist analysis, we will have a whiplash when the party is over, like the wet confetti comes down and they're looking for people to blame. I'd rather be on the side of socialists that maintain principles and honesty and clear analysis, right? And that's not saying that as some kind of beautiful soul and, oh, I wish to be, holier than thou. No, I think we say that with both a kind of intellectual honesty, but also through firsthand experience. Like, can we not learn about how things function in these cycles? We've learned a lot about left populism in our recent times, from the Occupy movement till now, and we analyze it. We analyze all of that, I think, pretty well.
Toussaint?
A few things. I'll say, firstly, I think butter yellow might be your color, Daniel. I do enjoy it. It's really refreshing. Also, Derick, I enjoy the green. You guys just came through, and it's like you planned it. I appreciate that. Secondly, my understanding of socialism is that socialism is for getting treats. I don't know. It seems like these symptoms
Isn't
are
that part? But seriously, Toussaint, like all jokes aside, isn't that kind of part of what this book is supposed to be addressing? That this idea that socialism is for treats. And in 2018, we saw people run and win on socialism is for treats. So, for example, and I think this is an example that people have forgotten because a lot of us in the left world have blacked a lot of this out. In San Francisco, the Bay Area where I am from, a man named Chase Boudin ran to become the district attorney. And there was a bit of a spate of these kinds of people that were running as progressive district attorneys. Kamala Harris kind of popularized the position of saying that she was the top cop, and that's kind of what you are as a district attorney. But Chesa, whose parents were weathermen, was a public defender, and he wanted to change the way that we viewed law enforcement. He won on a very progressive ticket, no cash bail. I'm going to hold law enforcement accountable. First thing he does when he gets into office is he gets rid of people that were problematic within the district attorney's office. He doesn't even serve a full term as district attorney. He's out. There was big money involved with getting him out. But ultimately, and again, I don't know if you guys remember this at all, he was blamed for the homelessness crisis in San Francisco as being not tough enough on crime. Now, keep in mind, he won, and other DSA socialists won in the city council of San Francisco on running on no cash bail, Medicare for all, police accountability. And within his first term, I forget what you call those elections, he's voted out. So what do we do? How do we address these issues when, on one hand, the people said, we want a person in office that is literally going to hold police accountable? But the same people say, but he's letting criminals go.
Maybe that's not the best position for a socialist to run for. It doesn't put him in enough of a position to give people treats.
So I want to talk about that maybe a little bit. Go ahead.
Please.
So a lot of this focus on getting people in the executive, and you'll even see people in your chat saying that that's where the power really is, because it involves the administration of a lot of resources. Historically speaking, executive gains are incredibly ephemeral in that once you change the executive, they go away. Mm-hmm. Without a massive legislative backing of that executive, what you end up is an increasingly centralized power in the executive, which is not particularly democratically responsive, except once every 4 years. And in regards to that, you tend to have these moves where these executives find out the limits of their power the hard way, and their movement starts to fall apart. You can see it with Trump today, even, but it's not even the first time. And Trump has exceptional power for an American president. The reason why I point that out is there is a focus on immediate returns that seems to be practical, but I'm going to say seems, because it is so easily undone. And I think if we look at that historically, this is the shift that people have. And one of the reasons why they have it, though, and to be fair to the logic of the American population, is that executives are easier to monitor. Thus, they have more accountability. It's actually often hard to find out what your representative is actually doing. It's all publicly available, but you have to read thousands and thousands of pages to figure it out sometimes. And the news is nationalized. The response you're going to get from most of these policies is that the right and the media go after them and they undo them. And I'm sorry, but if the discourse can undo you, your political position is weak. Period. End of discussion. And that's regardless. It's the same thing I say about people that say, oh, the West are why the socialist countries failed. That everyone knows the West was going to oppose you. That was known from moment one. you can whine about it all you want to, but it's like getting mad at lions for attacking gazelle. It's a fucking lion. That's what they're going to do. You have to be prepared to fight the lion. And so I do think we have to get beyond this focus on the executive, because what happens is, and I want to like justify this immediate response. If you are promising immediate gains and you have policies that don't have time to be implemented, that have seemingly, maybe even just correlatively or correlationally, have backlash effects, like, oh no, they don't deal with the homeless problem, blah, 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 we should lock these people up. That is very easy to manipulate the public by in any situation in any place on the planet. People might argue that Americans are uniquely stupid, but I've seen this all over the planet. Jason and I, we've talked about this in Mexico, where we both lived at different times. It's easy in a representational context where people actually do not have the burden of self-rule in a real sense for people to just react. And when you do that, you have a very volatile politics, particularly when you are focused on the executive, because you're not actually changing long-term laws. Now, laws can be changed. They can be undone by courts. They can be administrated poorly. This is actually the way that most laws are fought these days. They're not even negated. They're just poorly enforced. I'm not saying the executive does not matter, but what a lot of times when we focus on the executives alone, they're going to hit a wall with things like bond markets, with things like being dependent on politicians who are not actually copacetic for your agenda. And I'm going to be with Mamdani. This is explicitly the case with his need to balance the budget. He had to go to Hochul. He is dependent on Hochul. That actually is part of why his wealth tax was limited to a pet-a-terre tax. That's not even what he promised as the response. His initial promise was that he would do, if he couldn't get the wealth tax through, he would do a general property tax increase, but a variety of advisors talked him out of it. Now, again, we can go into the minutia of Mamdani's term, partly because his term is so young. Like I literally can go through everything that's happened because it's only been a few months.
6 months.
Yep, but that's it. That's not super long in the grand scheme of things, which is also why I think making this about people like Mamdani or even Sanders is a little bit wrong. The reason why we focus on things like Podemos and Syriza is you might say they had good policies, right? Their implementation was a disaster. And also, I'm not sure that I think Syriza actually had good policies. I mean, I think Grexit was setting Greece up to be crushed either way. And that is an unpopular position, but it's what happened. It has the unlikely and unfortunate backstop of being what history actually played out. What I predicted would happen to Greece is what happened to Greece. So I bring this up because people think that we're not, we're often talked about as we're only being academics or we're only using buzzwords. And I do blame this on the general crisis of literacy and the assumption, usually by populists, that working class people are fucking babies who don't understand what words mean and you can't explain it to them because they're fucking stupid. And I'm tired of that. I come from that background. I get tired of listening to people tell me that working class people can't understand me when I can talk to people back home pretty easily. I do have to change some terms. I don't speak like a professor, but they understand me. The other thing that I think that we often do not deal with, but it makes left progressives and left populists really, really angry, and they try to not entirely incorporate it, is they blame the working class for the unpopularity of their responses. But part of the reason why the working class has shown time and time again that they don't trust progressives and populists all that much is that they don't deliver things, or the things have unforeseen consequences that are not handled. And so you have like Brandon Johnson in Chicago. Yeah, you have I can't remember his name right now, actually, but I guess I could look it up. But the slow destruction of the socialist mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who was undone by the
Lumumba.
thank you.
Lumumba.
Thank you.
Lumumba, yeah.
Lumumba, thank you. who was undone. This was not his fault, but there was no way for him to get past it. And eventually the voters in Jackson blamed him for it, which was that the state legislature systemically stripped him of any power or any funding to do any of his programs in the first place. Much
worse than that, because they made it top 3 murder city in the U.S. and the consequences for that actually is that he will actually continue to be reelected because the people still identify with him, they still trust him, but he's absolutely kneecapped at the state level. And I went down there and spent some time. I actually got to meet his sister, who's this incredible figure. It's very tragic what's going on there in Jackson. It's mind-blowing, actually. And, I'm sorry to say that it's a very old-fashioned racist situation there. I don't know if you guys have done much on it.
No, absolutely.
But it really is. Yeah.
It's very, very much.
Still at the state level, it's disgusting.
And it's very odd that the Democratic Party machine says nothing about Jackson. Let's avoid that. Let's not talk about that.
Because the type of black politics you had in Jackson was too left for the Democratic Party machine. They were not the black professional class. They were left of the black professional class. They got no support from the black professional class. They were seen as the black left is always seen as the enemies of the black professional class.
And do you think Jackson also kind of just looks like a big pile of blight for them as well? Something that their opposition can use as saying, well, this is what happens when you have.
I think there's also structural impossibilities for the liberals to do anything about it, because they basically got him in a stranglehold down there. The Republican state legislature does, and they will punish them, and a lot of the punishment there is carceral, and so they take away the police, but then they increase the prison sentences. It's brutal.
It's one of the industries down
absolutely
there is
abusive,
the prison system.
Brutal. Some of the worst prison conditions in the country. It's a mess,
Yeah,
because also after the pandemic, their whole tax base left the city.
Bingo.
That was the main. That's the real material crux of it. So Lumumba's middle class base is absent. So that kneecapped him even further.
Yeah, when we look at this, because I don't want people to think that we think every progressive or left mayor is at fault for how things played out, nor do we necessarily think they had bad policies. The issue is there was no way for them to structurally overcome those limitations, and it's obvious that it would be that way. And there was no plan other than winning the executive office to deal with it. To be completely honest, what are you going to do in Mississippi if you win a mayorship? And then you still have to deal with the highly segregated and racially charged area of the region, which is also why I want to be very clear in this. We also talk about a lot of people do not think of as populist, but we do, because they try to render the working class in a static situation, mostly white hard hat dudes from the 1950s, which is not really the case of who the working class would be today. That sector of society, which is also not mostly white, to be quite honest with you, is only 8 to 9% of the entire workforce. Once you bracket out management, and even with management, it's only like 11. Even though it's a super productive part of the U.S. economy, and people think, oh, we don't make anything here anymore. Yes, we do. We just don't hire people to make things. It's made mostly by robots. When we talk about one of the things we talk about when we talk about lumpenization and the weird, situation of the quote unquote PMC, is that we are looking at working class fragmentation into the service sector, the development therein, what happened with profitability, although we don't go into extreme detail on this because it's only an 80-page book, but trust me, it's what I think the most about, which squeezed a lot of these programs out. And while if you're an MMTer, you can hope that MMT policies would get you out of the situation at a national level, which I am somewhat skeptical of, but MMTers do basically promote this. I would say Daniel and I would both say at most of these municipal and state levels, you're kind of in a bind about what's going on both above and below you in the political networks. So if you're a progressive DA and you're in California and you think you have Newsom backing you and the winds seem to change in 2 years because the homeless problem stays static and California is blowing all kinds of money not tackling it with weird neoliberal solutions, because the actual solutions, as Jason and I have talked about on different channels, are hard. They're very hard because you're dealing with a lumpenized subject. And this brings us to lumpenization. There's a weird mixture of just enough welfare state to keep people basically alive, but not enough welfare state for them to get back into quote unquote productive modes of society, unquote. And that in the US case in particular, since we've made prison a business, a lot of the handling of the surplus population, quote unquote, I'm not using that in a moral sense, I'm just mean by people who are pushed out of work, which right now, by the way, is 1/3 of all men between ages of 16 and 65. What happens to them, and the most part, is carceral. We put them in prison. And we're changing how we do that. It used to be the drug war, but enough people have gotten into drugs at higher class levels that that's no longer popular. So we're just going to probably make being homeless illegal, straight up.
Yep.
So the management of this population, which is also, of course, highly racialized, is a major problem for us, and it's a major problem for socialists, because one of the things that we have critiqued left populists for doing because of their focus on suffering is not really dealing with all the social problems that come with things like lumpenization. And that sounds like a big word, so I'm going to not use the big word. It comes from being precarious, pushed into areas where you cope more and more with drugs, not having access to the same social programs, which are all privatized or semi-privatized, to get out of that situation, unless you end up in the worst categories, which is usually homeless in a place like Skid Row. And then we respond from those worst categories forward, which of course leads to a backlash. We actually think this leads to a politics of resentment amongst part of the working class. One of the things that people should take heed, that Daniel and I are both aware, is that the working class in the core, and we focus on that because that's where we're at. I'm not going into the sociology of the working class all over the planet here. Has more pathologies and problems due to what's happened to the workforce in the 20th century than most leftists want to admit, and they're not things you can fix just by throwing money at it, or increasing college education, or just getting socialized healthcare. Although I want to be very clear, the fight for socialized healthcare is probably the first thing I would push for as an immediate demand, right? Like if I was leading a party, I think that helps the most people. It proves you're viable. It doesn't matter if it's a vaguely capitalistic policy or not. That's not why, you'd support it. So I don't want to sound like I'm coming down too hard on it, but you do have to deal with these problems. And a lot of the way we don't deal with these problems, the fragmentation of the proletariat, lumpenization, various social pathologies being introduced and maintained, is to just pretend that these can be mitigated by simple policy changes, which some of them can, but some of them cannot, or it would take generations to do. And there's no honesty about that, which again leads to a backlash. One of the things that we posit is that one of the reasons why backlash against socialists can be so profound is that even when these policies are decent, they're incomplete, and when they don't come back perfect, there often is just a defense of the policy, not trying to deal with the larger social problems that undergird it, and then there's a backlash to that. And I think that seems to be something that we can say would, like, pretty clearly off of the evidence at hand. And I'll turn it over to other people to talk.
Toussaint, do you want to add something to that?
I do. So I had said before that socialism was for getting trees, but also it is for banging your head up against a rock. Because the idea is like, you know all this stuff, but you need the workers to know this stuff in order to get stuff done. Also, you knowing this stuff makes you feel like you're not a worker. And then you're just like herding cats. And it totally affects your approach to workers and everything. I appreciate in the book that you guys try to tease out who the workers are, as well as who the PMC are, and how there are different groups within that group, and they might require different approaches to them. And that is where you got the title of the book, it seems. The people are not one. The people are legion. The people are they, them, there. So why was it important to you guys to make these distinctions and to explain that the people are not one?
Daniel, you look like you want to go off.
Yeah, I think, bourgeois politics desires, or wishes, it must keep the class fragmented, and resentment is a necessary feature of how liberalism sees, liberalism has always seen the plebeian. That's a nice populist category of mystifying the working class, the plebs, right? As a resentful lot, and the best we can do with the resentful lot is to sort of feed them snacks, make them a little bit happy through consumption, right? Mm-hmm. So that they don't complain, and keep them pacified. That's a general, it's why ultimately the political economy of populism is so copacetic to liberalism. And so a lot of these, social worker, university, Ivy League methodologies do not address the proper agency of the plebs when they do these programs in the inner city or for poor people and so on. Even the category of the poor is, I think, something that is a bit emasculating or sort of castrating, and it's highly problematic. But nonetheless, that resentment is real. The question, I think, is the resentment stoked from a structure, right, which pits lumpenized and working class communities and families into one receptacle and gives them no resources to mediate the conflicts that the system imposes upon them. If anything, the system then reroutes, and here I mean the system in the cultural sense as well, from Hollywood to Netflix to the worldview that the university installs in us. The system encourages that resentment to remain at a stalemate. So socialism for me is the transcendence of that resentment into something that is viably strong, where the agency of working class people can take the lead in addressing this problem, because liberalism will have a paternalistic coming in from on high where they valorize lumpenization. This kind of goes to Derick's point about the valorization of suffering, somewhat related to that. And yes, I think there's a valid way to think about the kind of problematic Christian legacy, which ultimately would be a perversion on Christianity, I think, if we're honest. So that to me is what socialism is about. It's not so much about creating treats, because if we think about socialism that way, M. Toussaint, I feel as if that's a socialism too bound up with liberalism.
Mhm.
And therefore, it's a socialism too bound up with a desire to maintain the status quo. And moreover, that's a socialism that will send the working class into the hands of the right, because it has already imminently decided that the worker is interminably resentful figure. And that's a wonderful entree to the right, because the right has a narrative, a kind of framework that seemingly satiates that resentment, right? And so to me, I think, even though in my last book before this one with Derick, I focused huge part on the problem of political resentment, this is a part of it. Lumpenization is definitely a part of it. And I think that, I'm always careful to invoke my firsthand experience. I think this is an abused category to always talk about that. But workers do know what lumpenization has done, and it is not pretty. It is not pretty, But practically, what lumpenization signifies also, in a very practical sense, even like practical, like Vivek Chibber in his kind of one-dimensional analytic Marxism, what it signifies is the structural incapacity for the working class to know what its interests are as a class. Now, one thing we didn't talk about is that a lot of our comrades on the left have theorized that the kind of engine of popular rebellion is driven by what we call surplus rebellions. And we might want to talk about that a little bit. I would actually be genuinely curious what Jason Pascal and M. Toussaint think about surplus rebellions, meaning like surplus populations, or to some extent, I guess it's synonymous with lumpen populations. We saw this with the Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton from the 70s in their main theorization, where, Cleaver famously predicted, as you all know, somewhat prophetically, that the white working class is becoming lumpenized, right? And of course, Trump himself, I think we should be honest, as Marx articulates in the Brumaire, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte very nicely, is that the Bonapartist figure could be understood as a choreographer or as a kind of conductor who is able to unite two contradictory class interests. This goes back to the problem of interests that should have no alignment with one another, namely the finance aristocracy with the lumpen. Yeah. And that's exactly what Trump, you could say, almost like the backbone of his whole coalition, I think Clyde Barrow's thesis there is correct. And thereby Eldridge Cleaver's prophecy is somewhat correct. However, a lot of our leftist comrades think that on the flip side of that question, somehow the lumpen purely, nakedly, as a class agent itself, spontaneously possesses some power, revolutionary power. Famously, this is through what's called communization theory, right? And we kind of say, in a way that's very provocative, I think, how is this different than a populist conception of class? Of course, I'll be very interested to see what communization theorists think of that argument. So far, they have not criticized us, but they will, which is fine, because we think that almost hollows out into a type of hyperpolitics when we theorize the logic of uprisings as driven purely by surplus populations. It doesn't kind of properly organize or mediate those energies. Although I will admit that the last sequence of left populist uprisings, right, from the movement of the squares to BLM and so on, were driven by surplus populations to some extent, right? But surplus populations are highly vulnerable for the most egregious abuse by bourgeois institutions. Bourgeois institutions, right? So I guess you could sort of say is that sort of the provocation of our book would be, how do we imagine a working class centered growth of institutions that would be more competent in mediating reality of lumpenization, not. And that's an exercise in thought that kind of goes back to Pascal's frustration, of the cart before the horse. Where's the institutions that allow you to make these statements, right? I suppose in a way, all socialism is fated to a bit of an idealist conundrum, which is we need to reform our ideas before we initiate these institutional changes, right?
Pascal, does it feel to you, to what Daniel said about the institutions, and there really is, no left within these institutions, so we're all kind of subject to the police, the state, if you will. Does that make this harder for you, this conversation?
I mean, I think the conversation is a very valuable conversation. It's not that the conversation is hard. It's the implementation of this into a reality that's really hard, with the existence of those institutions and the fact that they are so divorced from any type of realization of a socialist idea. And but I'm encouraged by the work of Daniel and Varn in this pamphlet, that they are thinking this through and they're taking the contradictions seriously and the difficulty seriously. And I think one of the things that they will be accused of being is ultra leftist. I don't think this is an ultra leftist pamphlet. I actually don't believe. I think it's too well thought out to be, frankly. And I think that the critiques that they have of left populism are very much true to Marxist ideology. I think that they're being very good Marxists in the way they are calling out the problems of the current fundamental working of left populism. And I'm going to be very honest, I just don't know how we get to a place where we have anything different than what we have now. And I'm not ready to say that what we have now is all that bad, because we haven't gotten to the fullest extent yet. We don't know what Mamdaniism is going to get us. We don't know what Chevalierism is going to get us. We don't know. We know what AOCism got us, and we're not too happy about that. But we don't know where this is going to go. But my question is, if we don't know where it's going to go, does that mean it's not worth trying? Are you guys saying it's not worth trying? Are we saying that we should abort the mission? Are you saying that we should abort future missions and change course? What's the solution? What's the action to be taken?
I want to speak a little bit to this because I think I'm the person actually, like, one of the reasons that people are surprised is both before and after this pamphlet is that I'm in the DSA after years and years of critiquing it, and being in the DSA, I haven't really changed any of my critiques at all. Actually, they're pretty much the same as they were when I was outside of it. The reason why I do think Pascal's question is so important, and it's one we think a lot about, is that Mamdani, even Sanders to some degree, I feel safer with you, Pascal, on writing off AOC, but Sanders' legacy is a mixed bag. There's all these Our Revolution packs. There's an entire NGO apparatus that's emerged around it that's under discussed by the left because they don't want to admit that they have some of the same shit that the center does. And in fact, right now, their stuff is more lucrative than the center stuff. The DNC itself is out as like $3 million in debt, and Our Revolution Pact has money. The issue that you have, though, and I want to say this because this is our point. The merger thesis and the current situation of the working class in the United States implies that populism is going to emerge over and over again. We think it runs out of steam faster and faster. Like, I can count these cycles. And we don't talk about this. I don't think, Daniel, do we talk about this? I don't think we talk about this in the book. But that I can count these cycles of like excitement and failure and almost now 2-year shifts. And in the middle 20th century, I was talking about decades, right? So like between 2011 and 2026, we've gone through at least 4 complete cycles of different forms of left populism come up, gain media notoriety, and go away. And in the United States, I'm not even going to Europe here, or Canada, or Latin America. I'm not talking about the peak wave. I can just look at it, and most of them have been relatively unsuccessful. And ironically, one of the things I realized, and this is not in the book, but it is in our response to Geese magazine, and looking at Bernie Sanders, is the more power Bernie Sanders had in the Democratic coalition, the less legislation he could actually get through. And that baffled me when I really started looking at it. I'll give you what I mean by this. Bernie's most productive period of legislation is between 2010 and 2014.
Yep.
He has a couple of policy victories in the Biden era as pushing for elements or amendments to the Build Back Better Act, which was the biggest, but that failed. The Inflation Reduction Act, where he got a couple of $1 billion for some very specific community outreach things and some stuff weirdly for Medicare bargaining. And then in the COVID Act, he got about $8 billion for health centers. And it is said by some people, but it's not in the legislative record, that he pushed for the bigger bailout. The issue that I have with that is the Biden bailout was actually less than promised. So I don't know how you could count that as massive a win as people say. My point about this, though, is if you look at the success of Bernie Sanders as a cultural figure on the left and what he can actually achieve in Congress, it is negatively correlated. And that is not discussed at all when we talk about practicality. I don't think this is just limited. Honestly, I wish I could say it was just limited to the interest, like left. I'm not even sure I would consider Bernie an inherent left populist, but his rhetoric is left populist. At 99 point versus the 1%, it's about the most left populist rhetoric you could possibly come up with. But in almost every metric that Bernie said he cared about, union density, medical reforms, et cetera, we are worse off now than before he ran for his first attempt at president. And his second attempt, where he incorporated a lot more progressive consultants, he did worse, even with the demographics the progressive consultants were supposedly speaking to. And I say this because the reason why we're intervening now is not because we think that all is lost or we should just give up. It's because there is still time to intervene on these movements and not make the mistakes that the European left populists did. But I'm not seeing that intervention happen yet. In fact, what I'm seeing is the opposite. I'm seeing the same things around Mamdani that I saw with Syriza, except when you think about it, that's kind of sad. Dealing with the mayor of New York versus a group that had both parliamentary and executive leadership in a nation. Mm-hmm. It is sort of like shocking. And I think back to Kshama Sawant. This is what I mean. It's not just the interest. Sawant got in office as a city council person in Seattle. Her first 2 years, she was incredibly effective. The rest of her tenure, the entire rest of her tenure, was using the resources of an entire socialist organization, SALT, to stay in office, and she was unable to get any additional city council stuff done.
Yeah.
And I point this out because this is the by and large larger trend. If we want Mamdani to be successful, you're going to have to protect him from the Brad Launders of the world. And if we're going to do that, I don't blame Mamdani for that, by the way. That is a perfectly logical thing for a mayor to do in coalition building. We have to recognize that as leftists. The issue is it's still our job to advocate more and push towards a more class independent direction. And if we can't do that, we are not likely to even get the populist policies as they're presented, which is why I think they tend to fail. But the other issue is there are people in this coalition and left populism who are going to betray you. Structurally, they almost have to. And it's not just specific individuals like Tish, and specifically in the Mamdani administration.
Have you guys looked into having I don't want to say debate because we're not into debatable stuff. I would love to see a conversation between you, Daniel, Bhaskar, and Ben Burgess on these subjects.
We're talking about it. They just come out with a book too.
They're going to go on a bit of a book tour, so they're probably going to do something live.
Yeah,
but I did want to.
We definitely are talking to Ben about setting it up. In fact,
yeah,
I did want to. Hey, I can be the host. I did want to talk about something that Derick brought up when it comes to Mamdani, and one of the big things that he was able to get past was the rent freeze. Right, we keep seeing comments in the chat, and kind of the crux of Pascal's earlier frustration is material benefit for a lot of quote unquote left populism. One of the big things he gets done is a rent freeze. Everybody's happy, but there is going to be a media backlash, as everyone on the screen has brought up. The media backlash has not really equated to much. Maybe it's just being done really badly, but no one seems to be feeling any feelings for the sad landlords that are complaining about how they can't raise rents, but their property taxes are going up at such a rapid clip, which isn't true, and they might lose money. It seems like in that regard, this new style of left populism that we're seeing coming out of the New York DSA actually has some roots and may be able to weather a lot of the negative publicity that is going to be hurled at it, especially as this current administration, was it NPSM 7? That says that the new enemy of the United States of America is communism and Antifa. All of us know about the Prairie Land trial and the 500 years of sentences people got for a lot of nothing. Right? One guy got 30 years for hiding zines. But does it feel to you, though, Derick and Daniel and Pascal and Toussaint is the only person here actually in New York City, that with something like the rent freeze, it has staved off a lot of the negative publicity that's come with this kind of left-wing victory? Toussaint?
I mean, for sure it has. Yeah.
I want to talk
but to who? To what audience are you referring?
I mean, the audience as a whole, the quote unquote working class, the lumpenized.
I mean, I think aside from Mamdani's function to rejuvenate a kind of generation similar to Obama. I mean, the fact that his mother got him that early training with Disney, I think, has been obviously very beneficial for him, because he's providing a kind of cultural moral uplift to a generation which is experiencing the reintroduction of the monthly student loan debt, which was, of course, paused for almost 5-6 years during the pandemic, combined with the cost of living crisis, which is unprecedented, probably since 2008, if not the OPEC oil crisis, right? So those are real. That's a real crisis situation. Now, from the standpoint of the Democrat Party and the capitalist class, of course, they're extremely cunning, and things move very rapidly in bourgeois politics. So, if Newsom is elected president, it's likely that Mamdani will be intentionally kneecapped more aggressively by the centrists than he is by Trump.
But that's what
very likely. That's very likely. But the point is that I'm trying to say is that the consciousness that we have about this moment of hopeful democratic socialism will face a structural barrier that the capitalist class will not prevent. Will then prevent that free kind of Disney hopeful Obama-esque. We can do this. We have some reason for optimism. That will be taken from us.
So
we should expect that. We should expect that to happen, not in any kind of nihilistic way. It's just a knowledge of the cycle of bourgeois politics and how these people operate. They're not good actors, right? So Mamdani's in that constraint. I think, I'd like to hear M. Toussaint's view on the rent freeze. Maybe she could jump in on that, but obviously, yes, I want to avoid the reduction of our political thinking to generational categories. But I do think that these things actually do matter a great deal, that we are able to name in a materialist way, for the first time in a while, on a mass scale, class enemies. That's refreshing. I'm never going to deny that. That is extremely refreshing. What's it like, though, for you, M. Toussaint?
So I will say that even before Mamdani got into office, I was able to be a beneficiary of his hard work. And a number of things that he's done have affected my life already. The thing with the rent freeze is I always make this joke on Facebook where I take a picture in the back of a cab of the little TV that they have where they show you commercials and stuff because Mamdani's always on it. He's always in the cab with me every time I get in the cab. So, I mean, I his presence is always there, but also there is this woman who works for some real estate company, and she's always there also talking about how terrible his policies are. So once you get a good message about what he's doing from him, you get a bad message from this lady right afterwards. New York City is very much about real estate. My understanding is that even though Wall Street is here, it's a financial capital. Real estate runs this city.
Yeah.
And there's definitely the New York Post as the propaganda arm of the real estate companies. And so there's definitely a steady flow of negative information about Mamdani and the rent freeze. But I would say that Mamdani giving us free buses, one free bus in every borough, is different from the rent freeze because that's a little bit more, I guess, technocratic. Apparently, half the people who rent in New York City have rent stabilized apartment leases, and
Can I talk about?
that's
Right.
really news. Well, let me just finish. That's really news to me. I think you don't see the absolute joy over that because you still need to qualify. And I actually don't. I do live in a rent stabilized apartment, but I don't qualify for the first year. I will most likely qualify for the second year because it's for 2 years. So, I mean, in terms of treats and making differences in people's lives that make them want to vote for you, that's maybe not as good a one as it seems.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I recently, and the Geese response went into the fine print of that law. One thing I get very frustrated with a lot of leftist discourse right now, particularly if you're on the Instagram and TikTok, is a lot of things are either oversimplified to the point of being misinformation, or they are outright misinformation. So when it comes to the rent freeze only affects, as MT indicated, rent stabilized apartments. That means it excludes market rate apartments and traditional rent control units. So if you're in the older subset of housing governed by the state level formula for rent control, this also doesn't apply to you. It applies to approximately a 1 million rent stabilized apartments, which means that it is big and that it affects 40% of the city. It is not all that new, though, in the sense that it's actually based on a de Blasio era framework called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act from 2019. And that was actually used by de Blasio to freeze rents for a year twice. What makes this actually such a big deal from the standpoint of why it's historic, despite what, David Thoreau is telling you that no one ever does this before, because yes, it's been done before twice in New York's history, and it didn't affect that many people, is that it affects more people this time, and that it applies for 2 years, not one. But there's also some issues of whether or not it's going to be legally challenged. And what because the one thing about the law is it really actually only kind of gives a shit about what we all think about it. And if there's a good legal challenge to this, it could fall apart very quickly. The other thing is you do have to apply for it, and so it's means tested, so it's not going to immediately go to everyone. I will, however, I want to point out, though, where Mamdani has a victory here, and I know this is strange coming from me, but there is a victory here, and that is the rent board that is independent. Mamdani appointed 6 of the 9 members. So he has the capacity in that board to be able to wield a fair amount of power on this in the future, barring other legal pursuits or the state turning against him, like this, the state Democrats turning against him. The feel right now, from what I'm gathering, is the Democratic Party realizes it needs a rebrand. The DNC is as I mentioned earlier, in deep shit, and the hostility towards Mamdani and the DSA has gotten weird, and that is intensified from elements of the centrist Democratic coalition, particularly from like the Atlantic magazine, where a lot of former conservatives write for and stuff like that. But you also see this push from elements around Obama to normalize relations with Mamdani, as if there's an attempt to bring him more into the party line. And again, this is why I said this seeing this as an active intervention now, where there's still capacity for these kinds of pushes, is super important. What I have noticed in the DSA is those aligned with left populism are afraid of criticizing Mamdani, or even a lot of progressive Democrats at all. And
can I say one thing on that too?
Yeah, go ahead.
My assumption is that this establishment will, as they do, likely know, or in a way that's very conniving and disingenuous, of course, box Mamdani into the liberal progressive identity politics thing, where they basically are assuming that they can constrain Mamdaniism to an urban professional phenomenon. And I think as socialists, for our knowing full well we have criticisms of Mamdani, we should insist that what he stands for is not reducible to urban professional locales. And we should ask, because we know that if Mamdaniism truly expands beyond that, then it's over. Then it's a real problem for the establishment. So the question, I think, for us would be, how do we actually facilitate that movement and be serious about? And that would require us to abolish, all of these kind of taboos and icons of irrationalism apropos liberal identity politics that they're going to put onto him, And I'm sure he'll resist it. I hope he resists it.
It seems like he has been.
He has been.
He's been really. I think he's been really good on. The way to respond.
There's reason to be optimistic about it, but there's also reason to remain very steadfast and very critical.
That's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah,
it's not about hero worship.
Sorry to interrupt there. I just wanted to say that little point there.
M. Toussaint, since Pascal is gone, you're gonna have to speak for him.
What did you say? What's the last? Since Pascal is gone,
you got to speak for him.
You got to be our Haitian firebrand.
Political economy and coterie. That is my Pascal impersonation.
It's horrible.
I mean, I hope that we can switch gears back, but I would like to know some of the tea and the hot goss behind the scenes with you two. I feel like Varn has a lot of friends I don't know about, and I didn't know you two were close enough to write a book. Word on the street is that Daniel came to Utah with a cattle prod and withheld Varn's Diet Coke and Coke Zero and made him write this book. Is that true? Did that did I heard also that he insisted on calling Varn by his first name, which no one is allowed to do.
That's
Deeply
also
offensive
not
to him.
true.
Only me. I get a pass. I get a pass. On
Well,
that.
can we be a little transparent here in that Derick is not just a man you see on screens. He is an educator, full time, in Utah. So it's easy to make excuses when that happens, to not finish projects. And Daniel was a big reason why this got finished. Derick, can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Daniel gave me deadlines. And he also wouldn't let me do what my big, there's two big flaws I have as a writer. One is I am aphakic and I use grammar very oddly. Daniel could probably speak to that, but he will be polite probably and not do that. The other, though, the bigger issue is that I tend to be exhaustive. I want to cover every single thing that we could possibly cover. And then, so what has happened with other book projects is I sit down and I start writing the first chapter and I look down and the first chapter is 200 fucking pages. And it doesn't, like, it only makes sense to me. I'm like, well, no one's going to publish an 800-page book. Not from
these small,
not from our level of publication. So Daniel made sure that that I was concise and that we stayed on topic. So we actually, I mean, we actually, I would say the weird about the drafting process for this book is that it was as much probably conversations as writing. When we actually started like really, really writing it, it was originally just going to be like a very short article, and we just kept them like, it's just, we can't stop here. We can't stop here. And so it got up to about 80 pages. But even that, you have to think about like my tendency to over explain things. And Daniel was like, no, we just need to focus on these things. We can come back to it later. We can come back to it in other essays or writing. And we have been slightly one of the more positive reviews that we've had. And we only had, it's a new book, so we've only had about 2 or 3. Did kind of point out that there's a lot of stuff that we just don't go into enough. Like we talk about it in a footnote, and we acknowledge it and move on. And that's just because of the scope of the book. And Daniel really kept that in mind when I was writing with him, is to keep the scope of the book pretty narrow. We weren't going to go into like balls and strikes on every left populist figure in America, or even if everyone that the left populists claim. Like, I'm not sure that I would actually call Mamdani a left populist for sure, 100%. But we tended to talk about things that we saw the course of life with in the aughts, in the aught teens, because then we could definitively say where it ended up. And we were also, Daniel was very good at not having us just recover the ground covered by Anthony Bourriello and Anton Yeager, who did a kind of, research project level book that's much longer than ours on left populism, and they declared it dead. And we, as soon as Mamdani came back, we were both like, I bet you we see left populism come back, but it's going to be more contested this time because of the previous failures, the frustrations a lot of people have with the squad and Bernie, both on foreign policy and on some of his behavior during the Biden administration, not so much contemporaneously. But the other thing that Daniel was very good at keeping me thinking about is like, we were thinking about this, we were trying to make our case not on an individual by individual level, but by looking at the theoretical problems that have largely emerged, unfortunately, in left-wing academic and Substack discourse, because frankly, this stuff is not discussed that much you know, in this way in the general public, and people are right about that. I mean, like they're not wrong. So working with Daniel was great. The other thing I would say is Daniel's one of the few people I know who reads faster than me, and I read very fast. So we were able to together, by breaking up readings, go through and read a ton of material from the 1970s through the up until like a year ago, to incorporate into this book, partly because we knew the material already and been discussing it for years, and partly because Daniel and I both read very fast. And so we could throw stuff at each other. We could throw books at each other. We could bring up our bugaboos that have come up in our shows and other writing, and we could flesh them out. And Daniel also, I'm going to give Daniel this credit because he probably, you don't think about it, but Daniel was also a great editor for me. And then I also want to thank Bram and Mike over at Revo Press, because they were also great editors. I mean, like, we got a lot of feedback from them about stuff that was probably going to come up that we didn't originally mention. Our easy misunderstandings that were going to come up with the book. There are still some complaints that we are too subtle. I've heard that more than once. And that we like academic words too much, which I
don't think so.
Terms. But we also were concerned with this being short and readable. Because, like I said, my natural inclination is to be like, let's start out with the history of the left by starting with Zoroastrian appeals to the general public in the 7th century BCE, and then work from there. And that's ridiculous. No one can finish that. So that's one of the things Daniel will put a stomp on.
Daniel, did you want to say something before we go about the joy of working with a mind like the Coke Zero swilling Derick Varn?
Yeah, I mean, I think the book's best contribution from my point of view was that when you write with someone who shares a lot of a common worldview, we share similar class origins, we share a very similar trajectory through professional institutions, and we both are known for attempting to revitalize, from a Marxist point of view, the thought of Christopher Lasch. My first book deals with the Lasch problem, and I felt that one thing that I really admire about this book was that we finally solved, I would contend, the Lasch problem, right? We put it to bed, whereby his insights can now kind of be circulated and discussed from a socialist point of view without that kind of devolving into some kind of weird cancel culture invective, excessive, problematic. So that's one thing I'm proud of. I think the other thing that the opportunity to write together allowed us to do was to say something in regards to what it means to be an intellectual based on our shared background that we couldn't say with as much force if we wrote independently. Right? So there was that. Those two things I think were useful. Yeah, I mean, it's also very interesting to, write with someone where it forces you to sort of ask, how can we speak in a united way together? That exercise actually strengthens and helps you discern where it is you're actually coming from. And I would encourage comrades to investigate, or rather to ask yourself, who would be a good partner for you to write with, I'm of the view, Jason, because I recently offered like a writing workshop for people, that the more writers we can cultivate in this space, the better we will be. So, bringing some of the things I've learned publishing books before this to this project, I was very happy to do it. It's a learning process, but I feel as if we're at an age where we actually can speak in a way that may be frustrating to some, because we often have the stereotype that academic language is a setback or a barrier. But I think the truth is that it's a passive aggressive stereotype. It's a kind of pandering stereotype to say that workers can't assess these ideas. So that's really what it's about. And I think the book achieves that accessibility problem as well, right? Lots of Diet Coke was had
on both ends.
On both ends. Not I mean, I'm very excited to take it on tour. If anyone wants to bring us to their city, they can pay all expenses, of course. No, just kidding. But we will have a nice tour on the East Coast and maybe the West Coast. M. Toussaint posted how to get a hold of the book. You can get it, first of all, buy the book if you could, because Revol Press is trying to rejuvenate serious left-wing publishing that's affordable to circulate ideas like this. And so it's worth supporting that, I mean, if it was like Springer or some of these like nefarious finance capitalist academic publishers, I would say like it's less important. You can just pirate it. But, I think it's a good comradely thing to not pirate it for the publisher. It's not as if Derick and I are making a killing off of this. But we hope to. I mean, it's already been selling pretty well, but certainly that would be beneficial for us. I'm also, Jason, writing a book where I will go into more depth on some of these questions about the theoretical nature of class theory. I have a contract for that. So, it's a routine. I think writing is a wonderful routine. I don't know how many of you are writers, but it requires this like daily practice, So I think that, Derick and I, it was nice to share that with someone on a daily basis. So it's been a real blessing, frankly.
Well, we have a very nice super chat from Prairie Fire. All right, I'm sold. I'll get the book, not because I know how to read. I don't. Solely to support the authors. They're lucky they are considered powerful sex symbols of the left.
Oh my God.
Thank you very much. Prairie Fire. Wherever you guys are watching.
Come on.
I am a giant potato. I just want to make that very clear.
Potato. Wherever you guys are watching or later listening to the show, there's a link in the description. Before there's even a description of the show, there's a link to the book at Revol Press. I actually just got a message from Mike from Revol Press that he's watching this show while he's watching a heavy metal concert in his Finland home. So that is a very Mike thing to do. Shout out to Mike.
Is Mike into black metal? I don't know. I mean, Finland.
A little. Our conversations are literally around the last days of Megadeth, as Dave Mustaine is.
He saw Metallica recently as well. Yeah.
You saw Metallica too?
No, Mike did.
Yes.
How do I pentagram star myself in his honor? I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, if you go into me and Mike's chats, there's a little bit of these kinds of discussions and a lot of guitar theory. But thank you guys for coming on. Toussaint, do you have any plans for the holiday?
I need to pick out an outfit to go see Daniel and Varn. So the book tour starts on July 20th. That is, my understanding, the first day of Thermidor.
Oh,
are you making shit up?
Nice.
That's funny.
What is Thermidor?
That is
The end of the French Revolution.
Yeah, French Revolution calendar. So they'll be in Philadelphia July 20th, Baltimore July 21st, Washington, D.C., July 24th, and in New York, July 25th.
And we'll also be in D.C. July 23rd, too.
Are you going to wear the Timberland shoe on your head? When the Timbo on the head?
Yeah. Too hot for that. Too hot.
Okay.
You'll
come as a Muppet then, maybe. Hopefully.
Yeah, maybe. Muppets don't get hot.
It's going to be amazing
awesome
to meet you. Hopefully we can get a photo and then I'll put it online And they're like, here she is.
No.
Gotcha. I would never do that. I would never do that. I'm kidding.
We're not doxing MT.
I would never do that.
Not doxing Derick and his first name.
I got to poke a little fun, though, you know.
I doxed myself on that, actually. I just gave up and started using it on Twitter so that they would match my ID with my... We're not going to talk about X drama. It's just too much. But I basically now
Derick
have to
and
be
Ben
known by my
Burgess.
full fucking name.
Derick and Ben Burgess got hacked on Twitter, and everybody started getting emails about them winning a contest.
Oh.
Yeah, don't respond to that. Also,
Derick-
Daniel's been hacked on Twitter too. So
Daniel got hacked on Twitter.
Oh no.
different time period, but yeah, or before us.
Did you really? Was it the same thing?
Let's do a whole episode on it, brother.
Fuck.
It's a deep state, Palantir. Like, this is like, you know,
Hey.
Gabriel Rockhill is correct. It's all.
Well,
it's
it's
all
seriously
correct.
about scandals. Be careful out there, people. I literally got a text message from my bank, and it was my bank, but it was not my bank. Like, it was the bank that I bank with. It was like a charge.
Oh,
was going
that's so
through your account.
terrifying.
Oh
Oh,
wow.
Jesus.
But you have to know how your bank communicates with you, and not everybody's bank
Right.
communicates via text message. So, you know, it's a dangerous business out there. So be wary of these scams. They can get the best and brightest of us.
That's right.
So thank you guys so much. Let's go out with some capitalist realist cartoons, and we are out.
Out.